The night was cold and still on the Wyoming plains when a wagon rolled silently through the darkness. Inside, armed men sat with rifles across their knees, their breath visible in the chill. The horses pulled hard against the weight, hooves muffled in the grass. The destination was the KC Ranch, home of Nate Champion, a man they had marked for death. The year was 1892, and Johnson County was about to explode into violence that would become one of the most infamous chapters of the American frontier. For years, tension had been growing between the powerful cattle barons of Wyoming and the smaller settlers who tried to carve out a living on the open range. The cattlemen controlled the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, a group of wealthy ranchers who dominated politics, law enforcement, and land rights. They had built their fortunes on sprawling herds and unchallenged grazing claims. But as more homesteaders moved in, fencing off patches of land and sometimes branding stray cattle as their own, the cattle barons saw their empire threatened. They accused small ranchers and settlers of rustling, often without evidence. The accusations justified their private wars, and soon the cattlemen took the law into their own hands. The flashpoint came with men like Nate Champion and Nick Ray, small ranchers who stood their ground against the cattle kings. Champion, in particular, had earned their hatred. He was a strong-willed Texan who ran a modest herd but refused to be intimidated. To the cattle barons, he symbolized defiance, a settler who dared to challenge their monopoly on the range. Rumors spread that Champion sheltered rustlers, though no real proof was ever produced. For the ranching elite, his stubborn independence was enough. The cattlemen gathered in secret to plan what they called an invasion. They raised an army of hired guns, around 50 men in all, many imported from Texas, seasoned with blood and violence. They carried with them a death list of settlers, ranchers, and alleged rustlers targeted for execution. Backed by their wealth, they outfitted the group with Winchester rifles, ammunition, and supplies. Their plan was simple: ride into Johnson County, kill the so-called troublemakers, and break the will of the small ranchers forever. On April 5, 1892, the invaders left Cheyenne by train, disguising their mission as a cattle inspection. They unloaded at Casper and moved north on horseback and wagons, slipping across the wide plains under cover of night. Locals grew suspicious as word spread of the armed column moving through the countryside. The cattlemen's secrecy began to falter. By the time they approached the KC Ranch on April 9th, the county was already stirring. Inside the KC Ranch that morning, Nate Champion and Nick Ray awoke to the sound of movement outside. The invaders had surrounded the cabin. The first shots came quick, splintering the door and striking Ray, who fell mortally wounded. Champion dragged him inside, returning fire through cracks in the walls. For hours, Champion held them off alone, firing with calm precision. He scribbled notes in his diary between volleys, recording the fight as it happened. Nick is shot and will die. They have killed him. I must fight on. His words would become a haunting testimony to the courage of a man facing impossible odds. As the day stretched on, smoke from gunfire and burning brush filled the air. The invaders tried to set fire to the cabin, hoping to drive him out. Champion shot again and again, killing several of his attackers. They closed in tighter, determined to finish him. By late afternoon, the cabin was in flames. Champion stepped into the doorway, still firing until his rifle went silent. He was shot down, riddled with bullets. His body was dragged outside, his diary left behind. The cattlemen believed they had struck a decisive blow, but instead, they lit the fire of open rebellion. News of the attack spread like wildfire. Settlers and small ranchers across Johnson County rallied together. They had long suspected the cattle barons of plotting violence, but now they had proof. Sheriff Red Angus raised a posse of nearly 200 men, ordinary citizens who saddled up to confront the invaders. Farmers, ranchers, and townsfolk rode out, armed with rifles and a deep sense of outrage. They swore the invaders would not escape unpunished. The cattlemen, realizing the county was rising against them, retreated to the TA ranch and fortified it like a stronghold. They dug rifle pits, reinforced the buildings, and prepared for a siege. The posse soon surrounded them, exchanging gunfire across the frozen landscape. For 2 days, the standoff raged, with bullets cutting through walls and splinters flying. The cattlemen's arrogance, once so secure, had crumbled into desperation. They sent pleas for help, knowing their position was untenable. Salvation came from outside. The acting governor, himself tied to the cattle barons by politics and influence, requested federal intervention. President Benjamin Harrison ordered U.S. Army troops from Fort McKinney to ride in. On April 13th, the cavalry arrived, their presence forcing the settlers' posse to stand down. The soldiers escorted the invaders safely out of Johnson County, placing them under nominal arrest. For the small ranchers, the outcome was bitter. They had surrounded the invaders, ready to bring them to justice for murder, only to see the killers protected by federal troops. The cattle barons returned to Cheyenne without trial, charges dropped under political pressure. The settlers' fury lingered, and though the invasion had failed to crush them, justice was denied. The Johnson County War ended not with punishment for the guilty, but with a reminder of how wealth and influence could bend the law. Yet the cattlemen did not emerge unscathed. Their reputation lay in ruins, their arrogance exposed to the nation. Newspapers from coast to coast condemned the attack, portraying the settlers as honest farmers terrorized by ruthless monopolists. The invasion became a symbol of the dying days of frontier feudalism, when a handful of wealthy men tried to rule by gunfire and were resisted by ordinary citizens determined to defend their homes. In the years that followed, the power of the cattle barons waned. The open range closed with the spread of fences and homesteads. Johnson County's settlers endured, their defiance remembered long after the invaders' names faded. Nate Champion, the man who fought alone against impossible odds, became a folk hero of the West. His diary, written in the final hours of his life, stood as a witness to the courage of one man and the brutality of those who sought to silence him. The Johnson County War remains one of the starkest examples of how the American frontier was shaped not just by courage and ambition, but by greed and violence. It was a battle for land and power, fought with rifles in the shadow of the Tetons, where hired killers met the fury of a community that refused to bow. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.